Hey guys, Hi-Fri here. So I'm just taking a break from making some AFEX units, and I just wanted to do a quick head-to-head comparison of the AFUL Performer 8 to the AFUL Performer 5. Firstly, I just wanted to give a huge shout out to Hifigo for sending these in, along with the Dunu S&S tips, the studio tips. They are pretty good tips. I like them. I think they're equivalent to like a reverse star line, but they're much easier to deal with because you don't have to make them. So I will leave a link in the description for the S&S tips if you want to give them a try, and I'll also leave a link to the Performer 8. Now, in my last video, I kind of did a head-to-head as far as the unboxing experience, the accessories, all that. Today, I'm going to talk about sound. So, just firstly, the Performer 8 is about $150 more than the Performer 5. So the Performer 5 is about $219. It might have come down a little bit from now. I think I've seen it at like $179 every so often. But I remember its retail price was $219, and then as far as the current retail price on the Performer 8, it is $369. So roughly $150. The difference that you get between the two, you get a better quality of driver in the Performer 8. You'll also get 3 balanced armatures for the treble instead of 2 in the Performer 5. You also get 2 more mid drivers in the Performer 8 as opposed to the Performer 5. So 1 dynamic driver, 4 mid balanced armatures, and 3 triple balanced armatures. And then for the Performer 5, it's 1 dynamic driver, 2 mids, and 2 treble. So anyway, let's talk about sound. Sound impressions on the Performer 5. It's a little bit on the fun side. The timbre of the IM on the Performer 5 is a little bit inconsistent when it comes from going from the mids to the treble. There's a little bit of BA timbre in the treble. But all in all, the Performer 5 is actually pretty decent IM. It has decent technicalities. Now, compared to other hybrids, like I said, I don't have too much experience, so I can't really give you a head-to-head between that and other hybrids. But anyway, it's decently tuned. It's got I'll show you guys a graph in a little bit, but it's got a slightly elevated bass. Then it's got a little bit of recess in the lower mids, followed by a pretty average Pina gain. It's like 10 dB, something like that. And then it's got a slightly elevated treble. Especially the lower treble, I think, has a slight elevation, if I remember correctly. But it's pretty well extended. It's pretty decent. The soundstage is decently wide. It's got a little bit of height and depth to it. So all in all, not bad whatsoever. Sounds pretty decent. Now, the Performer 8, how does the Performer 8 fare compared to the Performer 5? Well, I would say the Performer 8 is a lot less fun sounding. It's a lot more reference sounding. It's very neutral mid. So the low mid has a pretty decent elevation to it. And what that does, because the mids are slightly elevated, it brings down the bass compared to the Performer 5. So you get less sub bass and less bass overall in the Performer 8. Now, the quality of bass, it's hard to tell if there's any difference between the two, really. The bass definitely stands out more in the Performer 5. And I just kind of like the tuning a little bit more on the Performer 5. But for anybody who is, like a on-stage performer or something like that, and you want something very like reference sounding with pretty flat mids, the Performer 8 is going to do that for you. It has really flat mids. It's got a very low peanut gain. The peanut gain is more like 5 or 6 dB. So if you're in that low peanut gain gang, you'll like the Performer 8 a little bit better. The treble is also more refined in the Performer 8. So it's got a little bit less energy compared to the Performer 5. It extends a little bit better. It's got slightly better timbre to the treble. But because of the increase in the mids, the stage is a little bit different. The orientation is different. In the Performer 5, everything is a little more exaggerated. So you have a little bit more width, a little bit more depth to it. But in the Performer 8, it sounds more true to life, I guess you could say. So the Performer 5 is more in your head soundstage with things kind of branching outward. The Performer 8 is more like listening to a pair of, like I would say, bookshelf speakers. So where you have a traditional like pyramid kind of imaging. So it's like you can hear the two speakers on slightly either side of your head, and like they're projecting forward. Whereas the Performer 5, things are more kind of centered in your head, and kind of go out from there. I know it's kind of hard to explain, but the imaging on the stage on the Performer 8 just seems a little bit more natural, although it's also not as wide or as tall. It is it just sounds a little more natural. So as far as that goes, the mids have a tendency to kind of mask certain things. So because the mids are much louder, or at least the lower mids are much louder on the Performer 8, it has a tendency to kind of mask some frequencies in like the kind of mid to upper mid region. So anywhere from like 3 to 5K, somewhere in that region. It's not bad. It's just there's just a little bit of it. Just seems like there's a little bit of masking going on, whereas I don't sense any kind of masking going on in the Performer 5. The Performer 5 definitely feels more open, whereas the Performer 8 feels just a little bit more congested. Now, as far as the mids themselves go, and like your preference, your listening preference or whatever, they're just tuned to the point of being shouty or honky. They don't ever get to that point really, but they just kind of push up against that point. So so you'll notice, I'll show you a graph in a little bit, but you'll notice the peanut gain. Normally you reach your lowest point at around like 200 hertz, and you'll continue that amplitude or whatever until you get to about 1 kilohertz. And then once you get to 1 kilohertz, that's usually where most people like their peanut gain to start. But these start a little bit early of that, so they start just a little bit shy, probably closer to 800 hertz, I want to say. We'll see when I show you the graph, but it's closer to about 800 hertz. So what that does is, at least with the Performer 5, sometimes like male vocals can seem a little bit thin, female vocals can seem a little bit thin, just depending on what you're listening to, depending on the mix. Now with the Performer 8, you don't get that. Vocals are much more rich, they're more full, you get a lot more tonality, because you get a lot of your tone from your sub 1K region. So there's definitely a lot of body, a lot of warmth, a lot of tone, and then also what was I gonna say? So you have that south, of 1K or whatever. You also get a little bit more dynamic range from it, so it can go from quiet to loud a lot quicker. Whereas the amplitude, like listening on the Performer 5, is more. I don't know how to explain it, but things come across more dynamic as far as the range goes, like the amplitude. Things go from being quiet to loud to quiet a lot more. There's more ends of the extremes on the Performer 8, whereas the Performer 5 you don't get as much of that because of the lack of energy in the lower mid to mid region. So yeah. So anyway, but as far as the texture goes, the mids are definitely a lot smoother on the Performer 8. Very smooth, very natural sounding. Not the most detailed. Maybe lacking a little bit in resolution. That might just be because of the lower mids. Maybe, like I said, there's a little bit of masking going on in the upper mid. And that's probably just because of the amplitude in the lower mids. But overall, everything sounds much more cohesive, sounds much more just well balanced overall than compared to the Performer 5, where you have some slight timbre issues and whatnot. You don't really get those as much with the Performer 8. Now, there is a little bit of grain in the treble still. The timbre of the treble is a little bit it's more shimmery. It's got a little more splash. Or I mean, not a little bit more, but it still has some splash to it compared to the Performer 5. The Performer 5 has more of that just in general than the Performer 8. So the Performer 8 is definitely improved on timbre, especially in the treble. But you still do get some of it, but it's just in the upper end. So it's like the upper treble. But it's not bad at all. It's just you just get a little bit of grain, and it's not as smooth as the rest of the range. So it's not as smooth as the mids and everything. As far as bass goes, the bass dives pretty deep. Sounds good. It's pretty impactful. Also, the bass on the Performer 8, it's pretty tight for the most part. It's got good impact, good punch to it, but it's just very soft in volume, so it's just a little bit on the low side. But that kind of goes hand in hand with the whole reference style tuning. So like I said, these are very like reference neutral, very flat mids. That's how these are tuned. So these are very audiophilic, I would say. They're not perfect, but they're definitely an improvement over the Performer 5. I would say the Performer 5 is like their more immature, more fun, younger brother, whereas the Performer 8 is much more mature, a little bit more refined, definitely a little bit more cohesive as far as the timbre goes. As far as the timing of the drivers, it seems like there's a little bit less cohesiveness in the timing of the drivers. Seems like they're a little bit more like the bands are more separated, so the mids, bass, and treble. So in the Performer 5 seems a little bit more cohesive as far as the timing goes, but less cohesive as far as the timbre goes. So there's more abrupt changes in timbre. It's less well controlled. The mids are not as good quality, whereas the timbre is much more well controlled on the Performer 8. But there definitely seems to be a little bit of separation in timing between the bands. But that does improve the layering performance, I think. I think the layering's pretty good on the Performer 8. But it's also pretty good on the Performer 5. So it's kind of a toss-up, But yeah, so anyway. So definitely nice IEMs. I already went over the build quality. Build quality is about the same as the Performer 5. So yeah, so we got the Performer 8. It's got a nice face plate. It's got the little recess, not recess, but flush connector there. You can see there's just a little bit of recess in there. And then we have a black dampener instead of a white dampener for the treble. And that just goes to show that they're using a better quality of BA. It's a different model of BA because they're using the black dampener instead of the white dampener. The only reason why they're using the white dampener is because it's a cheaper balanced armature, which means they have to add more dampening to kind of pull down on that BA timbre. Also, there have been improvements to the nozzle. So the nozzle is thicker on the Performer 8, whereas it's a little bit thinner. It's more brittle, more delicate on the Performer 5. So yeah, so they definitely made some improvements to the nozzle. It's definitely more durable, I would say. But then as far as the rest of the package, it's pretty much the same. So the size is pretty comparable. There's just a minor difference in size. So the Performer 8 is just slightly deeper than the Performer 5. And it's slightly wider. So just ever so slightly wider. So not much difference in size. The ear shape's still great. The fit's great. Everything else about the IM is really, really good. Honestly, I kind of prefer the faceplates on the Performer 5. I just like that burnt foil look. Whereas this like rainbow look, I'm not as big of a fan of it. But that is just subjective, and that's, appearance. So obviously, everybody has their taste, but I just prefer the burnt foil. I think it looks cooler. But yeah, they come with a little bit of a nicer case, although not as rugged as the Performer 5. But yeah, so anyway, that's kind of the best I can do as far as the listing description goes. You got more reference, more audiophile sounding on the Performer 5. The technicalities aren't as good as the Performer 5. I think it just does a little bit better, but it's definitely a more mature tuning. The timbre is more consistent, so definitely quite a few improvements there as far as the sound goes. But then still, I just, there's something about the Performer 5 where I just like the technicalities a little bit better. Even though the timbre's not as cohesive, it's kind of all over the place, it's not very well controlled. But I also kind of prefer the tuning a little bit more on the Performer 5, and that's just because it's a more fun kind of signature. The mids are just a little too much for me on the Performer 8. I still think they're good, but it's just a little too much for me. So anyway, I'm going to pause real quick. I'll pull up the graphs. I'll show you guys the graphs real quick, and then we'll finish out the video. Alright guys, so here is the graph comparing the Performer 8 to the Performer 5. So the purple line here is the Performer 8, and the blue line is the Performer 5. So if we just go into SPL here, so this is the Performer 8 graph. You'll see that the peanut gain is very low compared to the lowest point of the graph, which is right at 500. Let me see, what is it? Yeah, it's like right at 500 hertz. So from 500 hertz, let's see, 112, 106, yeah, so it's literally 6 dB difference from the lowest point to the highest point of the peanut gain there. And then we lose a little bit energy up in the presence region. So this is where you get a lot of the perceived like resolution and detail. So there's a little bit of that missing. And then we kind of get into the brilliance region here. So there is a little bit of it. And then it kind of drops down a few dB, which is nothing wrong with that. This could be the coupler. A lot of my my 1+3s do this, where they kind of lose energy and then go down, but to my ears they sound perfectly fine. But yeah, decent amount of extension. The extension is really good on this IM. Doesn't sound bad at all. But yeah, so the peanut gain is very, very low. So if you're part of the low peanut gain gang, you will definitely like this IEM. But definitely the lower mids and the kind of mids in general, so the upper bass, low mid area is definitely more forward, more extended compared to the Performer 5. So this is the Performer 5 here. You can see everything's a little bit more recessed. Still very, very low peanut gain. It's not very high, but you can see there's all this depth in here. So the mids are definitely a lot more relaxed, especially when it comes to like the lower mid area. And then you get a little bit of unevenness in the upper mid kind of presence region here. But yeah, obviously this doesn't tell you anything about timbre. Still extends pretty well, although, you know, it's not as smooth extending as the Performer 5. You can see the Performer 8. Performer 8 is just a little bit smoother. In fact, it actually increases in energy a little bit as you get out a little bit more. Whereas the Performer 5, you get a little bit of zigzag. But yeah, so then we'll just go back to the comparison of the two, and you can see the difference. So you can see the Performer 5, the energy of the peanut gain starts at 1K pretty much. I mean, there is just a little bit before it, but for the most part, it maintains with the lowest part of the graph, and then it starts at 1K and works its way up. Now, it does start a little bit early. Some people like to see their peanut gain go up to about 3K. That's usually what Moondrop does. That's kind of their tuning. But in this case, both IEMs peak out at about 2.3K. Yeah, so 2K on the P5 and 2.3K on the P8. Is it gonna focus? Probably not. Anyway, but yeah, so that's the difference in energy that you're missing between the Performer 5 and the Performer 8. There's a whole lot more mids going on. There's more mid bass. The bass starts off the same and looks the same, but it's not because of how much difference in volume you get in the mids. There's this whole thing, you know, it's perception of loudness, what your ear hears. So even though both IEMs technically have the same amount of bass, you don't hear the same amount of bass because you have much more going on in the mid-range in the Performer 8. That essentially you're hitting a wall. So the louder you turn up the volume, the mids are going to hit you first before the bass actually hits you, or at least the mids are going to have more of an effect on your ears as far as the perception of loudness goes before the bass does. So anyway, so yeah, so that's the bass. And then as we get into the upper regions, you can see the Performer 5 just kind of zigzags a little bit uneven, whereas the Performer 8 is much smoother, kind of loses a little bit of energy, goes back down, and then it kind of regains energy in the, what is it, 6? Yeah, it's like somewhere around 6.5K to 8.5K, somewhere around there, and then it dips down. And yeah, so anyway, so those are the two graphs. Pretty similar, but also pretty different. They definitely sound much different to one another. As far as the tuning goes, I personally prefer the Performer 5's tuning, but the Performer 8 is definitely more neutral sounding. The Performer 5 is more relaxed. I like my IEMs to be darker. I don't like as much going on in the mids. It's just too much for me. So if you're the type of person who really likes their mids, you'll definitely like the Performer 8 more, and I would definitely recommend the Performer 8 for you. But if you're the type of person that likes a darker IEM, you're not as into mids, then I would definitely avoid the Performer 8, and I would go with something more like the Performer 5. If you haven't heard it, you know, But it's all personal preference. I mean, everybody has their own preference, you know. So, but as far as mine goes, I'm not as much into mids, especially this whole energy below 1K. I'm just not really a fan of that. I do like the sound of the Performer 8. I could definitely see myself listening to it. You know, maybe not a daily driver, but occasionally listening to it. But yeah, I much prefer the tuning of the Performer 5. I like a more fun, maybe darker tuning. You know, as far as the mids are concerned, I just like less energy in my lower mids. So, but anyway, guys, that is the video for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Just a quick one, just to talk about sound a little bit. As far as the rating goes on the Performer 8, I don't know. I'd give it like a 7 out of 10. It's decent. I think. Is it worth the money? For the most part. I mean, if you save up a few extra $100, you can kind of get into a little bit better territory. But I think this is probably the cheapest IM that you can get that has this kind of profile of mids. I think after this IM, you'd probably head to like the RSV or the Dunu SA6, and those are obviously much more expensive than the Performer 8. So do with it what you will, you know. Probably check out the Performer 8 if you have a friend who has one. See if you can borrow it. It's definitely a decent sounding IM, and it has decent sounding mids. But yeah, once you're done with the Performer 8, I'd say the only other thing that is really like reference style sounding would be like the RSV and the Dunu SA6. Those are the two other like really like reference kind of sounding IMs, but they definitely share just a little bit of DNA with this as far as the mid-range goes and the quality of mids that I heard out of it. So anyway, guys, catch you later. See ya.